Hello, everybody. My name's Corin Lightning, and I didn't get this voice just for today to sound, this is not my natural voice. So what happens when you eat something spicy and I don't tell you it was as spicy as they said? And I'm a baby spice person, like I'm pretty pathetic. So, well, thank you, Cleo, for having me. I'm very excited to be here and to present to you today on this topic. So we're going to go through a couple things. So one of the main things is that when I do these talks, I talk about that there is a possibility that I did not exist. There was laws put in place and policies put in place to ensure that I did not exist. So I am Cree from Samson Cree Nation in Alberta, Canada, and I'm a member of Treaty 6, which is a treaty that signed in Alberta. So it is in our area. It expands Alberta and Saskatchewan. And so my family is a member of Treaty 6. And so back before colonization, we existed, Indigenous people existed, continue to exist and thrive. And then as colonization happened and as people came into the area, laws were put in place, policies were put in place that wanted to make sure that the Indigenous people of Canada didn't exist, so that I did not exist. So had it not been for my family members and for them being able to be resilient and to live and to strive and for changes in law, I would not actually exist. So I am a lawyer by trade. I was a politician once. I was a politician and a lawyer at the same time, but then I had no friends. So I decided I'd go to therapy and just be a lawyer because that seemed a lot easier than being a politician and a lawyer. But when I went to law school, it was quite a shock for me. I was raised in an Indigenous community on a reserve. And so I really struggled with going to law school because it's kind of like going into a bubble with lawyers. And so being someone who was outside of that bubble, entering the bubble was a little bit different. And so I struggled with learning what the law was and understanding the law. But my first year criminal professor came, late Alex Pringle, he taught me that our stories are within our clients. Our stories are drawn out of the law, and to listen to the law and to be able to draw out those stories and being able to help people. And our current systems don't allow for the stories. Most of the time I have a fancy bag that says I'm billing you for this conversation. But we don't, we live our lives in minutes as lawyers. We don't live our lives in cups of coffee. And so I come from a community where we live our lives in cups of coffee, and where I sit with elders and go over their wills with them, or go over their residential school claims, or maybe go over a family matter with them. I go by the cups of coffee instead of the minutes, because I have to be able to let them listen to tell me their stories. Indigenous people are oral historians. A lot of the books, our history that's out there isn't written. We have ceremonies around witnessing. We have ceremonies around how we translate that law down from generation to generation, and it's not written down. These are my parents and my grandparents, and they lived so that I could live today. This is a picture of my grandmother, Alice Carter. She was taken and put into residential school when she was 6 years old, and her youngest sister was 4. They were taken and placed in Dalmas Indian Residential School. And she lived in residential school her whole life. While she was in residential school, her mother passed away, and then her sister also passed away in residential school. She was transferred to another residential school and ended up meeting my grandfather, and she also ended up being put up for adoption and then ended up meeting my grandfather. But she lived all of the things and never returned home to her home community from when she was 6 years old. And so when I think about her and the strength that she had to make it through all of the horrible things that she went through, it reminds me of the duty and the resilience that I have within inside. My grandmother wasn't the most loving person in the world. She loved me because I was her favorite. But she was always someplace that I could go if I wanted to if I needed a safe place. If I was, as a teenager, tired of my parents, I'm like, well, I'm going to go to my grandmother's, my Gokums in Cree. And I would go there and I would stay there, and she'd always make sure that I had a hot meal, or that I just felt welcomed, or give me some random gift. And she raised 11 children in a one-room log house with a dirt floor. And I'll show you a picture of that in the next slide. But her and my grandfather both went to residential school. The picture in the middle is a picture of my mom and my dad, and then there's me really cute in the middle. And both of my parents went to day school. Day school is an Indian residential school, but it's where you didn't have to sleep there. You got to come home on the bus. Or in my mom's case, it was like a horse-drawn trailer that they called the bus. And so they both got to go to school in the morning, and then they would both come home at nighttime. And they went to residential school until they were done. And then my father ended up going to get his post-secondary education after. But for them, it was very important that they raised us in a way of being proud of who we are and knowing who we are. And they made sure that we were safe, and they made sure that they provided us with a home that was safe and free of distraction, but also instilled the importance of education within us. The picture on the left is a picture of my two children, looking very sweet and innocent. They are now teenagers now, maybe not so sweet and innocent. But it's a picture of them as we went to Disney World and stood in line for this picture as an opportunity to show how much I've worked able to gain the privilege to be able to take my children to Disneyland. But also my children are the first generation in my family to have the option of choice of where they go to school. So they were the first generation of my family to choose where they got to go to school. I myself didn't get to choose where I got to go to school until I was in junior high. I went to a day school also, which is a version of residential school. But by the time I attended, it wasn't being run by the churches. It was being run by Indian Affairs. But the same teachers were there, but they removed the church, and the state ran the school. But it was still considered a day school. So my children have the first opportunity of choice of all the generations of our family. And so for me, it's part of the work that I do to be able to let people know that people's history is a little bit different, and the history that we learn about might not be the history of what is the truth. This is a picture of the one-room log house that my grandfather built for my grandmother. He built it in 1948. It's still standing on the Onion Lake Cree Nation Reserve that borders Alberta and Saskatchewan. And there's a picture of my nephew in there, because every year we go back to this place and we take our children back to learn about their history of their family. We teach them to learn about their culture. We teach them they have the best medicine picking spots here, the best berry picking spots here, and we're able to connect them and tell them about the history of their family, of their grandparents, of their parents, and of their great-grandparents, and how they came to be. And they get to learn a little bit about who they are and learn who their family are and learn where they come from, right down to the roots of where my grandparents raised. The house is still standing. We did take the picture and then quickly told my nephew to get out as it is very old, but every year we're able to go back there. So when we talk about, I am an Indigenous lawyer. My parents and my grandparents, my adopted grandfather signed Treaty 6. He signed an adhesion to Treaty 6. Later on, he didn't sign initially when they first signed treaty, because at that point he wasn't prepared to sign treaty, but a couple of years in, his community was really sick, his community of Sunchild Reserve. And so he ended up signing treaty so that he could get access to things like rations and medicines. So sometimes a lot of people say, well, we don't have relationships with Indigenous peoples because I didn't do those things. I didn't sign treaty. I didn't send people to residential school. I didn't do all those injustices. But we all have a relationship, because at the end of the day, I'm here because someone signed a treaty on my behalf. And you're here because someone, depending on your region of where you came from, somebody signed a treaty or a land claim or had a relationship with the Indigenous peoples of the land that you were on. And if you came here as an immigrant, that was possible because of treaties and agreements that were put in place prior to that to allow for us to be able to have Canada and US to be able to have people from all over the world come and live here and be a part of this. So at the end of the day, we are all connected, which is what Kodwin means. It means we're all connected. So why do we need to understand Indigenous peoples and their history, cultures, and laws? Why do we need to understand any other person's history or laws or their culture? Well, really, there's textbooks that say it helps, it creates you a better organization. There's stats, it makes you be a better organization. It increases your capacity, it increases your ability to work with clients, and then it increases your diversity. But it's essential to know these people, especially when you're working with them, because sometimes I find a lot of times people are only working with people, for especially Indigenous people, in places where the Indigenous people are the defendant, where they are the ones needing the legal counsel, not necessarily working with people of other color in their own as peers, as colleagues. And so being able to kind of rehumanize people to say that all people can be lawyers, doctors, all of those things is part of the work that I do. So cultural competency, again, it just means having more information and knowledge about other people that you work with, and it makes you more effective. And it makes it more effective for those people also working here. It makes them feel more comfortable. Cultural competency is in Canada, it's a word that's thrown around a lot. They're like, we have CPDs around cultural competency. It used to just be ethics, but now it's cultural competency. I don't think there's a way to be fully cultural competent. As someone who grew up in an Indigenous way, it would be like, am I competent as an Indigenous person in the ways of Cree people? No, I'm just learning. I still have so much to learn. So that's what I think. I think cultural competency and creating change in diversity in your workplaces, it's a journey, because it's always going to change and flow as things change and flow. But you'll have a beginning. Some of you may already be on that journey because you've chose to come into this session. But I really just hope that you leave this session with the idea and an inspiration to learn a little bit more. One of the things I always have to say is we have to check our biases, because when I have these conversations, they're very honest and truthful. But when I talk about Indigenous people and racism and discrimination, it's not with the intent to make people feel guilty. I teach a class called TRC, which is law. It's a law and justice, and so it's all with second year law students, and we talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we talk about justice in relation to Indigenous people for a whole semester. But we do talk a lot, because sometimes feelings of guilt do come up when we have these conversations that maybe we're a little bit uncomfortable with. But it's not meant to instill feelings of guilt. It's also not a competition. My story and the story of my people, it's just my story. There is no oppression Olympics. If there was, that'd be a bad thing. But there's no oppression Olympics. This is just my story. And when you think about people telling you your story in their workplace, it's their story. It doesn't mean that it's better or worse than somebody else. It's just their story. You have to take that for what it's worth. I always say we have to check our bias, our unconscious bias. And people are like, well, if it's unconscious, how do I know about that it's a bias? And so I always say the best way is to ask a 5-year-old. Because 5-year-olds, they just see truth like nobody's business. Like, you'll be like, does this shirt look good? They'll be like, no, it doesn't. Or, does my hair look funny? Yeah, it does. Like, they are so honest, it's painful. And my daughters are the same way, and my nieces are the same way. But sometimes the bias that we have, it's unconscious because we might not know it. And that unconscious bias can lead to things like microaggressions. And so microaggressions, they're not necessarily like massive things of racism and discrimination, like you can't go here anymore, you don't belong here, this room is not for you. It's smaller things like, are you lost? And smaller things like in conversations that come up from people acting with that unconscious bias. They don't know it, but it's small microaggressions. Think about it, about the mosquito bites of racism and discrimination. And when you get a lot of mosquito bites, it gets itchy, but there's no lotion to fix this. And so I think about it in the ways, a really easy way to explain unconscious bias. As an Indigenous person, it's something I experienced many times. And sometimes I dress up nice, like today, but then sometimes I would just want to wear sweatpants and a hoodie and go somewhere, and people have no idea that I'm a lawyer. So for example, just yesterday in the Hilton, when I checked in, they had a lady there who was giving everybody their Hilton honors, selling you timeshares and stuff. I didn't want to be sold a timeshare, but they came and they didn't talk to me. I walked by about 5 times. Not once did she acknowledge me. I was wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt. Like, I just took a red-eye flight because I was like, I'm going to go to Austin. I'm going to make the most of it. And didn't recognize me, not acknowledge me at all. I walked by several times. She talked to other people. And I just kind of was like, thought about it. And I was like, oh, okay, I know what this is. So then my friend came and was like, okay, let's get dressed and go have dinner. So I got dressed, did my hair, makeup, took my glasses off. I looked like a professional. And so then I walked by and, oh, did she want to offer me a timeshare? And she was like, oh, didn't this and this. Are you a Hilton Honors member? I'm like, actually, I am. And she's like, oh, well, do you want? No, I'm good. Oh, do you need points? No, I'm good, but thanks. I'm like, I also walked by you 5 times already saying you didn't offer me any of that. But now that I'm dressed professionally, you're offering me that. just because of how I looked is how she offered me something. And so for me, it was funny because I have no problem calling it out. A lot of times it's like that fight or flight. And I'm not the passive person. If you've met me, that's not a word that is in like my description of me. And so, but it's the same thing that happens all the time. And so it can happen when I'm at the grocery store. It happens when I go, I'll tell you about the security one. That one was funny. When I go through the grocery store, I go to the same grocery store all the time because I like to know where everything is because I'm old now. And when I got to my 40s, I like things to be where they are. And so I always go to the same grocery store. And I remember they had a new cashier. And I was in line, the person ahead of me, they were having like this great small talk. You know, that small talk chat. Oh, it looks like you're buying chips. Oh, it looks like you're going to have a barbecue. Are you going to have a party? Oh, a birthday cake. Oh, it looks like you're going to have a birthday party. Oh, you got those. Those were on sale. Oh, yeah. Do you need help with your bags? Do you need bags? Oh, no. Okay, well, you have a great weekend. Off that person goes. And then I come to the till and I'm ready for the small talk. I have made up stuff in my mind. I'm like, I'm ready to go. Let's have a conversation. And then she just kind of looks at me and just starts grabbing my stuff across the till. Asked me if I needed bags. I'm like, no, I have bags. Okay, across the till. Okay, yes, is your total. Gives me my total and I walk away. Next person behind me, oh, how are you doing? Just has the greatest conversation. And so what was the difference between me and those other two people? Well, I live in Leduc, Alberta. So I live in the other Wild West. and so they were both Caucasian older women. And I was a visibly Indigenous person. And I didn't get to have that great conversation. And so in that moment, it's like, how did that make me feel as a human? And was she intentionally being racist or discriminatory? No, she wasn't. She wasn't at all. Do I think she's racist? No, I don't. But I do think she has unconscious bias in the way she treats people of color. And in my community, there's mostly Indigenous people that would frequent that Safeway. So I didn't say anything about it. I just take that chip and I put it on my shoulder and I carry on. Eventually, you have so many of those interactions that the chip gets bigger and bigger. And so myself, I'm pretty good with handling those situations. I had a custom officer ask me 5,000 questions about how I was coming here. And again, I was dressed in sweatpants. I didn't look like a lawyer. I don't think he believed that I was going to a law conference because he asked the person in front of me like 2 questions. They had their suit on. They were ready to go. And then he asked, well, what are you going to Austin for? I'm going to a conference. What kind of conference? A law conference. Why are you going to a law conference? Oh, I'm a lawyer. Well, how long have you been doing that? Oh, give or take 16 years. Oh, well, what are you going to do at the conference? How long? I'm like, well, I'm presenting on Monday at 1:00. Do you want to tune in? And he was like, well, oh, you're presenting. Yeah. Well, what are you presenting on? And I was like, racism and discrimination. And he just looked at me, stopped. And he was like, how long have you been doing that for? And I'm like, give or take 16 years. He's like, are you annoyed? Yes, I'm annoyed. And he's like, why not? I'm like, because you asked me so many questions, but you didn't ask that guy a question. I said, just because of the way I looked. And he's like, well, you don't look like a lawyer. I'm like, who looks like a lawyer at midnight for a red-eye flight? But it's just an example of small situations. The way that I take them is very different than, say, a young Indigenous boy or a young person of color taking the subway to get to a law office. The amount of microaggressions they might feel. Somebody asking them for their ticket. Yesterday, we were literally walking on the sidewalk and there was a homeless, an unhoused person. They were just sitting there and people were walking towards us and we were just walking and the people walking toward us literally saw this person and they just made the biggest U-turn around him, almost crashing into us. And I was like, how did that person feel with that? And they didn't have the voice to be able to say, hey, that makes me feel uncomfortable. And I think about that when people are entering into our spaces of law, are spaces of law comfortable? When people come into your receptions or call your reception, is there places that people that they can talk to that they feel as a whole person, or are they already being interrogated before they even get a chance to talk to a lawyer? So sometimes I just think about even in the spaces that we have. And I used to work at the Law Society of Alberta, so we talked about a lot of those barriers that people had, like when people want to call and complain about a lawyer, which people love to do, but not Indigenous people, because most of the time we don't trust the legal system, and not necessarily people of color, because it's like, well, this nobody's going to believe us anyways. Like, I'm already on the defense. And so I said, well, Indigenous people aren't going to complain about the lawyer. One, because we couldn't hire lawyers until the 70s. We actually weren't even allowed to become lawyers. If I were to become a lawyer in the 70s, I would lose my Indian status. I would lose my rights to live in my community. I would lose my rights as an Indigenous person, my rights to treaty. So we didn't actually have lawyers until the late 70s and 80s. So people like Dr. Willie Littlechild, Roberta Jameson, these great lawyers, but we weren't allowed to. You could, but you had to give up your status. We couldn't even hire lawyers. If you wanted to fight the government for being discriminatory against you, you couldn't even hire a lawyer. You couldn't use your band funds, which were managed by the government, to hire a lawyer. And so thankfully, we had lawyers that worked pro bono, really great allies, that were able to do that work and kind of change those laws. And so when I tell people that, I'm like, so when people want to complain about the law, it's not a very comfortable place to come from when the law has been made against you for so long. And so they changed, because to complain about a lawyer, you have a form that you fill out on your Law Society page, and it's like, in 200 words, characters, type what you're complaining about. I said, well, they don't know what they know they were wrong, but they don't know specifically that they broke trust rule number this and this code of conduct. I said, and they have to write it out. I said, most of the people went to, their first language isn't English. If we went to residential school, I went to day school, and they didn't have the best English teachers. Like, they weren't hiring people who were winning awards. We were getting people who maybe couldn't get jobs elsewhere. And I struggled with grammar my whole life, and because of that. And so I said, how about if people, they're like, well, how do we flag if people are Indigenous? I'm like, ask them. They're like, oh, we can do that. I'm like, yeah, you can ask people, how can we help you better? And so they did. They flagged it. So now you check the box, and then you fill out a little bit of the form, but then somebody follows up with a phone call to kind of get that connection in case there's a language barrier, in case there's a barrier around fear, around safety, around making these allegations. So it's just a small change in the system. One, allowed them to tell their story, created a safe environment, and still had that anonymity to be able to access justice in a way that is safe for them. So it's just small things like, how can we make sure that our programs allow people to access justice as clients, but also as lawyers? So other things to say, we have to view things differently. We weren't all born with all the tools in the world that be able to just make us amazing people. We be amazing people by going to these conferences, by growing and learning and expanding, but one, also by being vulnerable. I'm vulnerable every day I walk into new spaces because I have no idea what's going to be there. I brought my safety blanket, which is my best friend, to this conference because I'm like, I'm going to Austin, come with me. And because it was a big place, and traveling alone as an Indigenous woman is not necessarily always safe. And so we have to view things different than the lenses we might have. So it's just getting tools, adding more tools into our toolbox, adding more lenses to be able to see the world differently or from other people's perspectives, and checking those biases and checking ourselves. And sometimes that means asking people who are around us, did I give off this vibe, or how was that? And asking for feedback and follow-up. When I do presentations, I have my friends who are super honest come and they'll sit in. And when I first started doing these presentations, like, okay, so am I coming off? How am I coming off? How is this reading? And they would give me tips, but they're very honest with me because I wanted to make sure that I was doing it in a way that was meaningful, but was also impactful. In Canada, we have, if any of you might not be from Canada, but we had residential schools, and the Indigenous people of Canada had a very similar but different history than United States. In the United States, they also did have residential schools, and they did have reserves, but they have a different legal system here. Here, it's very different than in Canada, similar but different. And so when they had those residential schools, they had this big thing over 5 years where they went and they had commissioners that went and listened to the stories of survivors for over 5 years, gathering the stories, gathering the information, gathering the truth. And they published a report, which is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. And there's a really long version of the report. And then there's like the 94 calls to action, which is our calls to action as Canadians, as people, as humans, really. And of these calls to action, there was many that were for justice, for health, and there was some specifically for lawyers. And so number 27 is, we call upon the Federation of Canada to increase lawyers' give lawyers appropriate culture competency training. Because in Canada, people didn't learn about Indigenous peoples in the history books. It wasn't something that was learned about. People didn't even know about reserves. People didn't know that we didn't have the right to vote until the 60s. Women had the right to vote in Canada in the 20s and 30s. Women of color got to about 10 years after that. And then the people of the North, the Inuit, they got the right to vote in the 60s. They got the right to vote in the 60s, but they didn't actually send them voting ballots. Like, you can vote, but we're not giving you the tools. And then First Nations status Indians didn't get the right to vote until later on after that. And so a lot of that history Canada wasn't like, let's tell everybody the truth. No, they didn't want to do that. It wasn't until within the past 20 years that we've been changing our curriculum to give accurate information about Indigenous peoples. So my story is a little bit different as an Indigenous person. I grew up on a reserve in my community. And I think when I think about people's stories, when I interact with people, everybody has a story. And so what is that story? And to honor that person, but to honor that story, and to realize that everybody that comes into our places is not people that come into those places in terms of, it's sometimes, I used to talk about going to law school and going to law events is I'm going into the bubble. I'm going to go talk to the aliens because sometimes that's what it felt like as someone coming from my community. I never knew I was different until someone told me I was. I didn't know that being Indigenous was bad. I grew up in a really good bubble with my family, making sure that we were proud of who we were and we were never ashamed of who we were, until I went to school in town. I went to town school. So it's a school in the town 15 minutes away from us. And it wasn't until then that I didn't know that I was different. My whole life of going to school in town, I never had any of my town friends, so it's predominantly a white community in Ponoka, ever come to my house or ever come to any of my birthdays. They never came into my community. They never came. Their parents were like, they let them be friends with me and I could go to sleep over at their houses. But none of my non-Indigenous friends were ever able to come to my house or come have a sleepover at my place. So I think so many times people think that going to reserves or Indigenous people going is that they're not allowed or that's taboo there, that it's dirty or whatever that is. We have casinos. We want you to come. We want you. We have gift shops. Come spend money. And my community, we have a Taco Bell, like a taco time. We have banks. We have the guy that makes the foot orthotics. Like, we want people to come into our communities and showcase who we are. And so, but back then it wasn't like that. And so it was really kind of changing that. I live my culture every day. So I'm an Indigenous lawyer. So I'm Cree. So every day I follow my Cree laws that I was brought up with and raised with. But I also, because I want to be a good Cree person, I want to pass it on to my children. But I also follow the laws of Canadian law because I don't want to go to jail. But I also want to be a lawyer. So in Canada, we have to swear an oath. We have to swear it to the Queen. I crossed my fingers, just kidding. No, but I did swear my oath to the Queen and I took that very seriously because I did want to serve my people and I wanted to serve Canada and be a way to bridge that. To bridge that in a way that is important to be able to create that relationship with each other for non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people. And so I took that oath very seriously. And recently I was called to King's Council, which is Queen's Council, which in Canada is like being called to the inner bar. And I took that very seriously because I want to create more spaces where Indigenous people are. And I wanted to make sure that I was in that space. And so when I think about people from other cultures, they're also maybe following two sets of laws of their own people, but also the laws of the bar association that they're part of. And sometimes those laws differ. Sometimes those laws might butt heads, especially when I have to go to ceremony or I have to go to a funeral. I had to go to a funeral recently and I was called back to the community. And so I told them, thankfully I work in a place where they understand. I said, but I have to go. And I said, and I have to go for 4 days. I said, I have to be there for this and I have to be there for that. So it's a requirement. It's a law in my community. And as the oldest, I'm required to go. And my family, I have an obligation to my family. And so they're very understanding. They understood it. But many times going to funerals might only be a 1 day depending on your HR policy. So thinking about how do we even develop HR policies that respect people's differences of where they come from. I have a very Indigenous worldview. I'm used to welcoming everybody. I'm very welcoming. My home is very open. We have big birthday parties. My kids' birthday parties were like everybody was there. Their grandparents, their other grandparents, everybody was there. They're used to growing up in a world where everybody's their auntie or their uncle or their grandparents. And they figured out that was very different when they went to one of their non-Indigenous friends' birthday. She came home and she's like, did you know Sarah only has one set of grandparents and like 2 aunts and uncles? He's like, I'm so lucky. I have so many grandparents and so many uncles. And I said, yes, that's awesome. And that's how we celebrate making sure they're proud. And their kids come to our house to our birthdays. And I was one of those very active parents on the Parents Association. I have a very different lived reality from the reality I grew up in. Conversational English is something that's easy for me. But again, I went to day school, so my English is not. Some people use very big words. And I'm always like, check my phone. What does that mean? How do I use this in a sentence? And so it's something because, again, my education was different until I did go to law school. I didn't make it through, and we continue going on. Life in the law is different, especially for people of color. Coming to this space is different. I thought property law was fake. I've said this in a lot of spaces. When I first learned property law, I was like, why did they make... Because Canada, we're based in common law, and so we're based in these laws of England where all of our first cases of property law are about some old angry guy getting mad because his neighbor built a fence too high, or his neighbor's apple tree is growing and the apples are falling on his side, or somebody put a sign up and it's obstructing his view of the sun. All of these crazy things about fences and property and whose apples on what side. And that's what I learned about. That was my first experience of property law, and I was like, studying with my friend, and it was 20 years ago. My friend's actually the one that's with me today. And I was like, it's so funny that they make up these cases just to teach us about property. And she's like, what do you mean make up? I'm like, well, like, about these fences and stuff. And she grew up in the city. And I'm like, about these fences and stuff. I said, just to learn about the role of the rules of property. And she's like, those are real, Corin. Why do you think they're fake? I'm like, well, I grew up on a reserve. We didn't have fences. And if there was an apple tree, everybody gets to go the apple tree. If I want to go to my cousin's house on the other end of the field, I can go in there and walk in, and they're obligated to take care of me and feed me and give me tea. When people come to my family for help, we're obligated to help them. There's no property line. There's no fence line. That's not something that I grew up thinking was having an idea of communal property, going into a place where personal property is a thing. So I decided, well, if I'm going to learn about property, I'm going to learn about all of property. So I even took like advanced property and everybody hates property. So I'm like, I'm going to take advanced property and I'm going to really push this idea of property. And so I ended up doing well, but I really challenged that concept of property and thinking about property from different cultures. Where is the space for that in our law? And where do we begin to do that? How do we deal with those type of things? So, for example, if somebody were a pawn shop, somebody were to pawn a cultural artifact under Canadian or U.S. law, the pawnbroker has that right because of laws of property. They have the right to take it and sell it and do whatever they want. But under the laws of my community, you actually don't have the right to sell cultural artifacts. You don't have the right to just give it. There's things that protocol that has to be done. You actually can't just keep a pipe and put it together. There's laws that are unwritten that we have around those ceremonial objects. And so we see those clash and we see how do we work those out. Fortunately, sometimes and I get calls from elder being, this is a case I want you to take. And I'm like, well, Canadian law sucks in this area, but let's go have a conversation with this pawnbroker and see if we can reason with him. And fortunately, many of the time they're very understandable and they respect the community next door. And we've come to a understanding. But what would happen if that was taken into a court of law? What space would that be held there? Sometimes I have to be more and do more as a lawyer. Most of the time people don't think I'm a lawyer. Like, as you can see, all the cases I've given, I can still walk into a courtroom, into a courthouse and still get asked if I'm lost, if I'm safe, if I need duty counsel, if I'm Native Counseling Services, which is like a court, it's not a lawyer, it's just like an advocate, or if I'm Family Child Services, something. And I'm like, no, I'm a lawyer. And I get asked that every time. I even got one of those annoying rolling briefcases. I'm like, this is what lawyers have. I'm going to have one of these and carry it around and people will know I'm a lawyer. No, they still didn't know I'm a lawyer. And so But so I always have to do more and be extra just to make sure that people understand that I'm a lawyer. And that comes from many people from different cultures, because sometimes it's always assumed that we are not the lawyer, but actually I am the lawyer. Why do we have these conversations? It's important to have these conversations, real conversations, to create safe places, because sometimes we're just doing that performative action for diversity. There was a law firm in Canada. They're like, we have a very diverse firm. We promote diversity. But then I don't know if they have a conversation with whoever did their promo or whoever did their publications. But then the poster that they put with it was just all one type of male. They didn't have any diversity. It was just all older Caucasian men. I'm like, oh, but you just said you did diversity. Why are all your partners not diverse? And so really thinking about the performative action versus real action and those real conversations. And those are places where people will be safe and want to go to. Cultural awareness, it does increase. Creating diversity, we're all serving different types of people. I once had somebody say, oh, well, I don't need to learn about Indigenous law. I'm going to go into corporate law, so I don't need to know about Indigenous people. I'm like, well, did you know that in this past year, I've had to have a corporate lawyer to incorporate my business? I needed to buy a house. I needed to do a wills and all of these things. Like, we have banks, we have businesses. If we do need corporate lawyers. So you do actually need to know about Indigenous people. Rehumanizing people is something that's really important, is rehumanizing people and doing that in a way that gives people dignity and respect, but not in a way that gives pity. So when I'm doing these conversations, I'm never looking for sympathy, because sympathy is like, oh, here's $1 in your cup, away I go. I want empathy, because empathy is what creates change in people. It creates that change. They will want to do that change. Creating real concrete change really starts with education and having conversations. Indigenous people, we have distinct differences. I am not the same as Indigenous people from this area. We have different cultural practices in how we operate. We have different cultural practices in how we believe, even in terms of how we, who is the head of the family. It's different in some it's matriarch, some it's patriarch. It really is very different depending on where you go. I've talked a lot about residential schools, but residential schools, the last one closed in Canada in 1996, and I think in the United States it was about the same time. The facts about residential schools and what it did to Indigenous people is it took away a lot of things. It dehumanized us, but one of the key things that I think about residential schools in the United States and in Canada is that it took away people's ability to love, our ability to know love, to give love, to receive love, because you didn't have that interaction with your family every day, with your mother, your father every day, packing your lunch, setting up to school, tucking you in at night, saying I love you and good night, giving you the bath. You didn't have that. You didn't have those small moments to know what is appropriate love. You only had the negatives. You didn't have that positive. And so a lot of the time that when I think about reconciliation and having those conversations is about how can we return love back into our communities. And so when I think about people in places that maybe are not to live not to the fullest extent because they still have a lot of trauma, I just think about that loss of love and how can we support that healing through love and some of that trauma and what happens. And I use that as a way to kind of, you can see empathy, because you can see, you know what that is, you know what that love feels like, and you can imagine what it have to not have that, for whole communities not to have that, for whole generations not to have that, and what that would do to an entire race of people over time. And there's things like loss of language and culture and trauma and other things. And that repeated trauma of having to continue. In Canada, we're just now going through another class action and another class action. Indigenous people did have a deep distrust of the justice system. And many people of color do have a deep trust of the justice system, because unfortunately these systems were not made with us in mind. In Canada, they actually were made for us, to keep us in boxes. The RCMP were created, and it was as enforcement against us, to make sure we didn't leave our reserves, to make sure that we kept in our boxes, to make sure they created a rule that said our kids had to go to school, and they would come and take our kids and go to school. And so when we think about that, it's not necessarily a relationship where we're going to become best friends. It's going to take a long time because of that harm and trauma, and that acknowledgement of harm and trauma. Do they acknowledge the trauma that they have, the harm that they did, in order to really build a relationship? So justice sometimes isn't as easy as we think it would be. The lived reality is why I hate the law. I don't hate the law, but the law has been designed to work and enforced against my people. Society encouraged generations to believe that my people were less than. When we were put in residential schools, we were taught that we were less than, that we weren't worthy, that we shouldn't be Indigenous. And that same curriculum that we were being taught is what generations of kids across Canada are being taught in non-Indigenous schools, that Indigenous people were not worthy, that they were less than. And so it's taking generations to switch that thinking, to change that thinking, to be able to get people to think, no, Indigenous people can be just as anybody else is. Society beginning to perpetuate those stereotypes. How do we begin to build trust? How do we begin to reconcile that trust? There are distinct cultural differences that people have. For example, eye contact in law. So I do a lot of help. I help a lot of Indigenous students that are in law that want to go work for law firms. I read over their resumes and I give them test interviews because I know they're going to go into a space where those interviews are not necessarily part of their cultural norms. Like lawyers love a firm handshake and a good eye contact, like eye contact, handshake. It's so awkward, but for me, but I know that's a thing. And I know that's part of the social norms of being a lawyer. And so some people have that teaching where eye contact is seen as a sign of respect. So we don't make eye contact with people who are higher than us as a sign of respect. And so, but I tell them, when you're in these interviews, you have to talk, you have to make eye contact, you have to direct, you have to have the firm handshake. And I said, this is what works in their culture. And then I've had to tell them, you have to be prideful, like you have to talk about yourself, but all your amazing accomplishments that you have. They're like, oh, that's being conceited. I said, no, you have to be prideful. And we're taught to have humility. If I go into my community, they make sure that they know who I am and where I come from. They care about who my parents are, where my grandparents are, and who I am. All of the things that are behind my name, all the letters are just things. It's not about who I am. And so we're taught to be very humble. And so sometimes for students going into these interviews, it's very difficult. And I've also worked with other agencies that are under this, that are interviewing students. And I've talked to them, I say, when you're interviewing Indigenous students, these are things to think about. Their culture, they might have different cultural norms than you. If you're interviewing a female and you have a panel of 3 males, that might be intimidating. Or if you're interviewing a male and you have 3 women, they might not feel that it's respectful to talk to them. Like, because they see them in a higher place, and so it might be seen as a sign of disrespect to talk to them. So really thinking about those cultural norms of people that are coming in front of you for even just simple interviews. And so we have connections to our community and land, and so when I tell you that my children, we always go back, it's something we always go back to my mother's home community. And this year we didn't get a chance to. My children are feeling it. They're like, when do we get to go back? Can we go back at Christmas? Can we go? Because they need to come back to their homes. They need to know where they need to have that connection. In my community, when you are born, when you're a baby, when you have that little belly button, when that part falls off, we take that belly button and we go plant it in our communities. And we plant it in our home and outside of our homes as a way to connect our children to our community so they know that they have that connection to land and territory. So my children are very connected to their Gukum's house because that's where their belly buttons are planted. They always want to go home. I always joke with my other sister. She's also a lawyer. And because she's a gypsy all over the place. I never know where she is. And I'm like, do you know where your belly button is? Because you're never home. And she's like, actually, I don't. And so, but it is just to really have that connection to their homes and to have that thing. And so I always use that in the child welfare concept. When babies are apprehended, are their birth rates as children of that community? Do they have rights under their culture that and laws that they have to follow? So sometimes those babies that are apprehended in child welfare, they might not have that right to that belly button ceremony. They may grow up never knowing where the belly button was planted. Learning through stories is how I teach. It's how I learn. When I ask my dad something, I never get a straight answer. I can't text him. I'd be like, hey, tell me about this. He'd be like, come see me or call me. I'm like, okay. And so it's always having to have that conversation. I can never just ask an elder. I can't have phone a friend, phone an elder for a question that I have about culture or laws. I have to go offer them protocol, have a seat. They'll text me, but they won't. They might even Zoom me because now since COVID, I've got some elders up on the Zoom. And so learning through stories is very important. And that's how we teach, and that's how how we always, for histories, have been able to pass on our stories and our laws. Moving forward, again, looking at communities as not cultures of poverty. Sometimes what we see about communities is only what we see on the news. You only see the sad stories. We don't see the celebrations. I always encourage people to celebrate the people, go to celebrations of people other than yourself, to be able to see and be in those celebrations, but to honor those people. When I had my KC ceremony, I filled that courtroom with as much Indigenous people as I could. And I made sure that I wore a ribbon skirt and I honored my family and who I was. And I was fortunate that one of the judges that was sitting there, was 27 judges that were sitting there. One of them was an Indigenous judge, and she also wore her ribbon skirt for me. And the other two women that I knew that were Indigenous were being called. It is very important to kind of take that space, but also to show people that we are rich with diversity, but we are not. Poverty is just what you see, but our culture is not a culture of poverty. We have an increase in Indigenous lawyers, judges, and doctors. We have strong sovereign nations. I always say don't make assumptions. I'm a very much ask, but I'm also very much Google is your friend. There's so much now on Google that if I always encourage people to seek out, do your homework first before asking those questions, because the answer might be out there, and then maybe just ask the person as part of a clarifying to make sure that you're getting the information from the right place, or ask for recommendations. When in doubt, ask. And they're not the lucky ones. I didn't beat the odds. I did the same tests. I did the same classes, wrote the same papers as all of my non-Indigenous colleagues did. So I'm not the lucky one. Because sometimes when I meet people, I'll be like, oh, hi, I'm a lawyer. Oh, good for you. And it's very patronizing. I'm like, yeah, good for me. Like, but you didn't say that to Tommy over there. And so really thinking about even how we address people and the conversations that we have with them. Creating change, debunking that myth, doing more and being more. The change that we create in our workplaces can't just be in the workplaces. It can't just be performatory. It has to be in our whole selves, into our homes. Because eventually our children and our partners are also going to go out into the world and create change and do work. So making sure we're instilling those same values in our workplace, in our home places, so that it kind of has that ripple effect. Being an advocate. You have a voice, and sometimes using that voice is uncomfortable. I used to sit in meetings, and I wouldn't feel comfortable talking. So I had a friend in the room, one of my colleagues, and I would just text him my comments because sometimes they wouldn't pay attention to me. I'm like, okay, here, text my friend, and he would ask it. And he would be like, okay, I'm going to ask it. I might get in trouble, but I'm going to ask it. And so he was really using that voice for me because he had a space and he was in that room with me. I always say, can you imagine a society or a justice system or just a bar where people have taken cultural awareness training and diversity training, where everybody is? In Alberta, we just had every lawyer in Alberta had to take a CPD, which required them to learn about Indigenous peoples. In 2021 is when they had to take it. We're at 2021 and every lawyer finally had to take this 3-hour course. It was equivalent of social studies grade 8. Every lawyer in Alberta had to take it. It was just a 3-hour course. In Alberta, we don't actually require any reporting of hours. We don't have to, at midnight, at the end of fiscal, take a bunch of courses to get our CPD credits. We just have to declare we're going to be a better lawyer, basically. And this is the one course that they had to take. Every lawyer took it, but then the lawyers that didn't take, and if they didn't take it, you got disbarred. But then what ended up happening in Alberta, because it's Alberta, is we had 51 lawyers put their name to a paper to say they didn't believe in having to take cultural awareness training. I have their names and their addresses. But they said, we don't think this is an infringement on our charter rights. And that's what I said. And so it was something that was not a good thing, but we ended up fighting it. We ended up having to use the voices of our allies. We created allies and accomplices, which I'll talk about in a second. And we came together and we mobilized. So the Law Society had a meeting of all the lawyers in Alberta on a 2-hour Zoom. They organized it. It was a lot of work. And we had to vote on whether or not we wanted this to stand. And so 80% of the people voted telling these 51 people saying, this doesn't belong here. We believe in cultural competency. But it took a lot of those allies, the people, the head of big law firms, the head of our insurance agency, past presidents, having to step up and use their voice. and create change in their own firms, getting everybody in their firm to show up on that meeting to vote against that. And so, but it took a lot of work and we were able to do that. But it wasn't the 10 Indigenous lawyers. Well, I think there's about 20 Indigenous lawyers on the call. We weren't going to create that change all by ourselves. We needed our friends to come in and do that for us. And so it really was about how they were able to create that change and do that change. So we won. Change comes from other people. I didn't make that change in the Law Society by myself. We did create a letter. We did a lot of in 3 days, I got 400 signatures, but that there was more than that showed up at the meeting, but it was getting that information out there. Because nobody checks their Law Society emails. They only check it because we would check it to see who got disbarred. We're like, well, I'll read this one because I want to see who got disbarred. Those are the only emails that people read. I used to work at the Law Society, so they've changed their process. But what voice do you have that others do not? What room are you in that other people are not, where decisions are being made about other people? And how can you use your voice in those rooms? Or how can you make sure that other people in that room are allowed in, or bringing people in that represent that cause? Are you active or a bystander? And sometimes it's easy to be the bystander because sometimes being active is uncomfortable, or sometimes it might mean stepping on our elbow zone. And that's totally okay. But how you can even create change as a bystander. What do you teach in your classrooms, in your firms? What kind of culture do you foster? Do you foster a culture where there was a firm that when we had this big thing, one of those lawyers from that firm was one of the 51 people that signed that letter. And that firm sent a message to that lawyer because the managing partners of that firm all signed on to my letter and they all showed up. And they sent a message to that one lawyer saying, hey, this isn't a culture we have here. And I had lawyers from that firm who are my friends calling me saying, this person doesn't speak on our behalf. They're not our friends. We don't believe that. We're going to show up on the call. And so really sending that message in that firm, where I actually ended up hiring that firm to do a real estate deal for me, because I'm like, actually, I like your values. You showed up for me. So now I'm going to get you to do my house, to do my real estate deal, because they showed me that they were going to show up for this that day. Do not dismiss opportunities or people, and thinking about it, sometimes just taking a small chance on something. Somebody asked me, well, what's a small thing you do? I'm like, think about where you have your meetings. Think about who you cater. Do you use a big caterer? Do you use an individual smaller caterer? And how can you create more opportunities for even people in your organizations to get out and be in different spaces? Meetings, food, easy things to change. I was sitting on a board meeting and we got 2 very small local caterers that came in to food I would never have experienced had it not been part of that caterer. And we were able to support small businesses in that way. Law school can be traumatizing for Indigenous people and other people and other minorities. And so sometimes we don't think about that, but being an Indigenous person who sat in the back of a criminal law class when they were we have a lot of hunting cases in Alberta and Canada, and all these Indigenous cases come. Everybody turned to look at me to ask if I knew that person that in the case, because I was Indigenous. I'm like, no, I don't know them, but I know as a lawyer. But I'm like, no, I don't know them. I don't know every Indigenous person. Ally versus accomplice, and this is something to think about. An ally is someone that says, I'm here for you. Whereas accomplice is someone who says, I'm here with you. And so I think of my sister, my adopted sister. She's a photojournalist, and she's been in very places that were they weren't safe doing photojournalism. And some journalists stand outside and they're in the background taking their photos. No, she was in there with the people in the protests inside when the army was coming to remove them. And she got removed and got sent to jail. But she was there with them to make sure to capture that story, to capture those details that the news wasn't telling, because where the news was like blocked out. They're like, nope, there's no news. There's nothing happening in this community. Oh, really? Because my friend just posted on the National Post, who she's working for, that this is actually happening, whereas the government was trying to hide what was happening in that community. So accomplices are people that are there with you. They're with you in those trenches. They're with you. They were those people that signed, the 40 people that signed their names and firms to that letter where we said, we need cultural competency. They were there with me. They signed and put their name to pen. And now people know that those firms support cultural competency. So that's a small way to be an accomplice. It's not bad. Not all accomplices has to be bad. Reconciliation and emotional wellness. Sometimes explaining racism is difficult. I am not a human version of a Wikipedia. Google is your friend. I always think when people sometimes ask me things, sometimes I go into places and it's not necessarily my role to have those conversations, but I end up being in that role because I had to do some education. But sometimes the emotional labor that we have. So I sit on a board, it's an insurance board, and they're like, we want you guys to come in and can you talk about, basically I talked to them doing today. And I was like, okay, I'm like, so am I being paid as a board member and as a contractor? Or like, am I being paid additional? Or no, we're just doing it as a board member. I'm like, why do you want me to do a board member work and emotional labor work? That's not the same. I'm like, so I think I need to be paid extra. And they're like, oh, we didn't think about that. I'm like, yeah, you're doing me extra work. That's actually emotional labor on top of my already duties as a board member. So also really thinking about that. And the other thing is pay structures when we're paying people to come for our services. So a lot of times I get asked, well, what's your honorarium? What's your honorarium speaking fee? I'm like, well, what would you pay a 20-year call male lawyer in the same position? Well, we pay them this. Okay, pay me that. Because I'm the same level of experience. And they're like, oh, okay. And so it's just sometimes making sure that we're kind of valuing people at the same value. Creating change is not just our day job. It's important to honor our history, our legal traditions, and it's not just our day job. It's taking that work that we do in the day to home, because that's where we can start to see that real change. These are some resources from Canada. I didn't get a chance to go on the US ones, but the Advocate Society there, they do have some resources that they've created, guides on how to work with Indigenous people. They have other guides that they've created. The Indigenous Bar Association, we're on National Association of Indigenous Lawyers, Indigenous Canada, which is a course that you can take. It's free. A free course you can take about learning about Indigenous people. And there are lots of many other courses out there. The next steps, I always think about this. So one time somebody asked me, I was in an interview for a position I did not get, because maybe my answer was a jerk. But I said, they're like, how long is this reconciliation thing going to take? I'm like, the reconciliation thing? I'm like, one, it's not a thing. And then I was like, pivot, don't be a jerk. And so I was like, well, it took us 7 generations to get here, and it's going to take us 7 generations to get someplace normal, to get to someplace that's better. And that's what Justice Murray Sinclair said. And so I said it took a long time to take that damage, and so it's going to take a long time to get back to where we were. And that was my answer. I didn't get the job, but that's okay. It's probably the best thing considering that's what they asked me. That's what I always think about, is how do we want to be part of that change? How can we move? How can we be allies? We all need allies. But then when is the time and point where we might be called to be that accomplice? So thank you for having me. That's my contact information. So hi.
Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to know if you noticed any change since the attorneys began taking the course.
Yeah, I've noticed a lot of change. One of the biggest places I've seen changes in judgment. So seeing judges being very open to Indigenous legal traditions and being open to that. Seeing firms, one was seeing how many firms said, no, we believe in cultural competency training, and the amount of support that I've had in my role when we were doing that work. So I've seen a lot of change in that, and then seeing a change in judgment, seeing the change in supports that we have in the justice system, and I think that for me has been a real success.
Thanks for that question. Thank you. Any other last question before we go? Thank you for your attention. Thank you so much, Karin. It's lovely to see you again. Thank you so much.